Folks, thanks so much for tuning in. We're still on the road, but I want to get the news to you, the top of the news, the top stories, and the insights behind that you're not going to get from mainstream media. I'm going to switch up the format a little bit today. Some people are saying they really like the culture end of the show. Others are saying they like some of the more hard factual, and we're going to just switch it around a little bit. Something for everybody for sure. So let me know how you like this. Just start with a couple of the sort of interest items. You might call them the culture items right here. Just to show how crazy it's getting. We'll look at some of the stuff in the U.S., bounce to Canada, and then look around the world really quickly, but see how it all kind of ties together. In the situation as far as people running in the U.S. and in Texas, you saw and we covered and we predicted accurately that Thomas Massey would lose his seat. But there's another interesting one that's developing there. We've got Maureen Galindo. She's running for the Democrats in Texas District Congressional. This is the primary now that she's running in. And she is saying, here, this is actually part of her platform. She's saying that the ICE detention center, she's going to, in her area, in her district, this is where illegal immigrants are detained until there's a court order to deport them. She's going to turn that into a prison for American Zionists. I'm not kidding. I'm not making this up. It's going to be a place where Zionists, American Zionists, people who support Israel, will be put in prison. So it just gets wilder and wilder. And talking about wild and on shows, and I'm hoping to eventually get the number of listeners that someone like Candace Owen gets. I'm not there quite yet. Maybe she wants to come on my show, but she's got Hunter Biden coming on her show. Hunter Biden, remember Joe Biden's son, and he had all the problem there with his laptop and all the stuff that was on there. He is he's coming on there. And quite interesting that he actually went on her show and he talked about how Israel forces other countries to get into war. So he's taken a very anti-Semitic approach there, along with Candace Owen. So interesting to see Candace and Hunter kind of hitting it off there. Listen, I'll tell you how good AI is getting. There's something called the Commonwealth Short Story Prize. It's awarded every year, and of course to story writers around the world. The winner this year, the name is Jamir Nazir, and the story is called "The Serpent in the Grove." Here's the interesting part. Jamir Nazir may not even exist, the reports are telling us. And in fact, people are saying it seems almost certain that the entire story, which was a great story, was written entirely by AI. So it shows folks it's getting that good, and AI that doesn't even exist is winning prizes, and people are not able to detect when it's AI or not. Well, over at Harvard, Harvard's been under criticism for a number of years now because they give huge amounts of A grades to 84% of the grads wind up getting getting A grades. It's unbelievable, and a lot of concern about that. So the story, as it goes in the news today, is saying that there's been reaction, there's been pushback, and so they're going to make it a little more difficult. They're going to start awarding more B grades. Everybody doesn't get A grades. Here's the interesting part. 85% of the students that were surveyed said they disapprove of this change. They want everybody to be getting A grades, or at least 85%. Well, that's an interesting situation there. We'll see what Harvard does with that story. In the New York Times today, because I like to talk about some of the trends and some of the Gen Z trends and others. But it's the whimsy trend is being talked about in this article in the New York Times. Whimsy. And it's just related. It's something that people are using in advertising. They're saying get some whimsical this, some whimsical decor, some whimsical jewelry, and it's related to the pressure apparently that Gen Z and millennials are feeling, being on doom scrolling all day long. And even somebody's offering on her podcast to buy whimsy pajamas. And the analysts are saying it's a result of we're so wired up, and we're so pressured by all the time that we're spending on our screens. More and more people are doing whimsy buying. Well, as they're doing that, there's a interesting article in Dazed magazine. That's not Dazed, that's Dazed, D-A-Z or Z-E-D, that young women are saying more and more that with the relationships they're having with men, they say they're finding a great reading gap. The young men aren't reading anymore. I'm not sure if they did before, but so much so that 80%, may shock you, it shocked me, 80% of the people who buy books, this is in the UK and in the US and in Canada, 80% are women. And men that are aged from 25 to 34 are usually and much more a big part of the podcast audience. But 80% of the books that are sold, UK, US, and Canada, are bought by women, and women saying that they are first checking out now if they're starting to date someone. Does that person even read? If they don't read, it's kind of a red flag for many women. Well, we'll see where that goes and where that takes us. Well, let's get down to some serious stuff now. In Canada, the federal government there just made a decision, as if it wasn't getting bad enough when we have said that we're, as Canada, that the Prime Minister is pushing us closer and closer to a relationship with China, to the point where, as you know, we've reported last week, we're one of the first to report, that the U.S. was reporting that they're going to be scaling back the high-level intelligence sharing they're doing with Canada. This would be on terrorism information and on threats to Canada, because they can't trust Canada quite as much since Canada is drawing so close to China. And the federal government has announced now that it's going to shut down one of its naval stations up on Baffin Island. That's in the Canadian Arctic. And it's called the Nanisivik Naval Station. They're shutting it down. They're saying it's just too expensive to run. I've lived in the Arctic for over a year, up in Inuvik and up near Tuktoyaktuk, or Tuktoyaktuk, as some would say. Not a good signal. They say there's a lot of cost going into keeping it updated and keeping it repaired. There's some speculation that the reason the Liberals are shutting down it was because when Prime Minister Stephen Harper was Prime Minister, and recognizing that we have weaknesses as far as in our Arctic surveillance, and so a number of naval stations and northern sites have been put in place, and this one they're shutting down. People are saying it's political, is because Stephen Harper, as Prime Minister, put it in there as a conservative. Not a good signal that we are continuing to send to the U.S. that we're drawing closer to China, getting less information on the borders, and now shutting down. They didn't have to, the speculation is they didn't have to shut it down. They could even just say they were maintaining it or looking at it. So disturbing signs coming out there. You're probably aware that Kyle Busch, this is for the world champion car racer, the NASCAR car racer. And some people who are listening to this and watching the podcast might think you're not, really zeroed in on NASCAR, but the people you hang out with, your partner might be. So you're going to sound really on top of it by lamenting the fact that Kyle Busch, absolutely famous NASCAR driver at a very young age, 42, I believe, died suddenly. And what they found now is that, and what they're reporting now, he was actually in a simulator. The top race car drivers, of course, they spend a lot of time in race car simulators, honing their skills, and he was found dead in that simulator. That's kind of adding a little bit to the story. We feel for his family and for the fans, but an interesting development there. The story, and it's not just a story, it's a fact about the continuing concern relative to the Ebola crisis and coming out of the Congo. This particular strain, it's called Bundibugyo strain, very severe, often fatal. And now again, a Air France flight that was headed for Detroit got diverted to Montreal. So there's concerns there on the Canadian side. But I continue to say, media, of course, are going to broadcast on this, as they should. But they're starting to become, not panic levels, but people are starting to become really concerned about should they be going out because of the spread of this Ebola virus. Folks, it is rare. It's when you consider the number of people in Canada on any given day or in the United States that are dying, that actually die from a gastrointestinal problem. This is minute, and so I'm just saying, sure, it needs to be watched, it needs to be tested, but people can calm down a little. Well, you've been hearing, and we've been posting here, there's a bit of a trend going on with so-called with teens, and this is happening in Canada, it's happening in the US mainly, where all of a sudden, because of massive use of the screens and their iPhones, all of a sudden, like 1,000 or 5,000 or 10,000 people can show up at one place. And these teen crowds or teen brawls are continuing. And some of them, especially in the Florida area and others, entire beaches are being shut down. If it's a club area in the evening, all of a sudden there'll be like thousands of teens showing up, a lot of damage being done. And so the Attorney General in the U.S. taking quite an approach. Attorney General Pirot is saying that they will start prosecuting parents. If the parents aren't keeping the teens in check, teens will be charged, and then they will look for assessing damages and suing parents for the damages. So maybe that will help. Maybe it won't. We'll have to wait and see. Okay, now back to what we usually start with, which is the continuation related to Iran. We've got Marco Rubio, Secretary of State in the U.S., saying that because Iran is saying they will start tolling, and in other words, start tolling large amounts of monies for ships going through the Strait of Hormuz, Marco Rubio is saying that is going to be seen as illegal. Iran definitely hurting in terms of the oil that they usually sell, like huge amounts to China and other places, has been stopped, and huge pressure coming on the regime. Whether the people of Iran, who continue to be under severe fire, quite literally, from the IRGC, from the Revolutionary Guard in all the various cities across Iran, it's very difficult, and I think it's going to be far-fetched to see an actual uprising from the streets when, as soon as you step out of line, you get shot or hanged. But the pressure definitely continuing on Iran. We're keeping an eye on that. Well, in Texas, the Texas Children's Hospital, one of the most famous in the world, has made quite an announcement here. They're going to open their first detransition clinic. This is for people who are concerned about the gender transition that they were given, maybe when they were younger, maybe today, and they're starting. They just had to settle a $10 million lawsuit from one of their doctors who had recommended, without real consultation, detransitioning, recommended puberty blockers and surgery to a client. More and more of these clients now are coming forward. They're suing because they say their lives have been destroyed. And so Texas Hospital, along with paying out that $10 million, is actually going to be opening a transition clinics. Some of that is happening at other places in the world. It's just lunacy on when you still see politicians afraid to raise this issue. This is an 80-20 issue, folks. That means 80% of people from all parties say that transition should not be happening, especially among minors and under 18 years old. And this is now becoming a reality in terms of people really getting heavy-duty lawsuits. Well, as the U.S. continues to put pressure on Iran, they're still putting pressure on Cuba. If you have not been to Cuba, or if you have been, but you've stayed just in the main tourist areas, you've never seen the poverty that is rampant through Cuba and has been that way ever since the communists took over under Fidel Castro. And the threat now of people are saying, well, is there going to be an invasion because Cuba they're running out of absolutely everything. When I was there, they were running out of a daily basis, running out of food. They couldn't pay their doctors. People who wanted to go to a clinic had to try and find some money and pay the doctors themselves. U.S. Mainstream media and Canadian media still, for decades, has not reported on the fact that the Cuban experiment has been and is continuing to be the communist experiment, a total, complete disaster. And a poll was just done by El Toque, that's a Cuban news site, this is not a U.S. site, found that 56% of Cubans living on that island would support a U.S. military invasion, the majority of Cubans saying they would support that. You know, This needs to be taught at our schools, the dangers of this type of socialism, and it needs to be taught and spoken about more in media, how socialism like this just impoverishes people. And there we have the Cubans, 56% of them hoping that U.S. invades militarily. I don't think the U.S. prediction here, I don't think you're going to see a U.S. invasion, but interesting to see. Now, talking about people being impoverished, those of you who like soccer and those of you who don't, maybe your partner does, you can talk about this. Lionel Messi, fabulous, fabulous soccer player. I mean, it's like saying Tom Brady to a football fan. He has now officially become classified as a billionaire, joining the soccer players or football, as they call them around the world, who are billionaires. Of course, David Beckham famously has been in that club for a number of years. And when Bernie Sanders and other U.S. politicians go after billionaires and say they want to stop these nasty billionaires, they always go after the ones who are creating jobs, thousands and thousands of jobs, and who have thousands of millions of dollars worth of charities, but they leave the athletes alone, and they leave the singers and the musicians alone. So billionaires, I would say to Jeff Bezos and others, if you're a billionaire, take up singing as a sideline, and then all of the politicians who want to get votes by crushing billionaires, and of course then crushing the job market, you'll find favor. You'll be able to avoid them. So take up singing, take up soccer, see where it goes. Well, a very interesting development in Canada with in the First Nations community. In Fort McMurray, the Fort McMurray First Nations, the chief there and one of the counselors are being accused of sending an invoice to another counselor, an invoice requiring that counselor to pay $421,000. And the counselor who got sent that's Samantha Whalen, she's saying that the chief and the other counselors sent that to her to scare her off from running for election, because if you're going to run for election, you can't be in debt to the council. And so now they've taken that to a judge for some ruling, and interesting development there, a new scare tactic in terms of how to get people from challenging you in politics. Well, Eric Church, if you haven't heard of Eric Church, interesting last name for a person of faith who's also a singer, just gave a commencement speech, not valedictorian, but he was the invited guest speaker at the University of North Carolina. And it's gone. U.S. News is reporting, and there's a report there. The reporter there is Nicholas McIntyre, reporting that everybody's saying this is the greatest commencement speech ever. I don't know if it is. It may be. I've listened to some of it. I haven't had the time to listen to it all. But what he's doing, he's comparing life to his guitar. And he compares like E string would be maybe the talk about eternity and different things. I guess he got a lot of chuckles when then he talks about each of the 6 strings that necessary to be in chord. He got some chuckles when he talked about the G string. But really a powerful message from everything we've heard, even people who are not people of faith saying, really, it's one of the greatest commencement speeches they've ever heard. So you might want to tune in. You'll find it online. That's Eric Church. Thanks for tuning in, folks, and keeping yourselves nicely tuned. Talk to you tomorrow.